So what's going on, guys? DIY Dan here again, and this is another episode of Outdoor Living. So you'll notice how dirty my pool is in certain spots. Now, we've been having this issue for about 6 months, and I just hadn't got around to figuring out what was going on with it. And this is my pool a day after replacing the part that I cover in this video. Now, our pool is a Shasta. It's a self-cleaning pool, and we've had it for about 10 years. Now, besides doing the routine maintenance of cleaning the filters 1 to 2 times a year, this is the first major repair that we've had to do to any of the equipment involving this pool. Now, due to the fact that I hadn't really messed with pool equipment that much, I wasn't quite sure what was going on. I thought maybe I had a hole in my filter. I thought maybe my suction was clogged on the main drain of the pool, and I had experimented with all of those before actually finding the actual problem. Now, this is a self-cleaning pool, and there is a gear planetary set basically in the self-cleaning aspect of the pool filtration. This planetary set is what is responsible for changing the spray heads of the self-cleaning pool to the different sets in order to clean the entire pool. So after 10 years of use, what happened with mine is one of the gears had gotten stripped out. Because that gear was stripped out in the housing, it was not rotating as it should, and it was basically stuck on the same set of heads for extended periods of time, causing a very dirty pool. After replacing that gear set, my pool was back to normal basically the next day, and I'm going to show you how easy it is to do. Now, obviously, depending on the pool system you have, it could be a little different, but I think the general concept of what I go over in this video will help you out either way. Now, I was told that I have a low profile T-valve setup in my in-floor cleaning system. I was told there is also a ball valve style of kit. And then if obviously there is a low profile, there must be a standard profile as well, I'm guessing. So keep that in mind while you're watching this video, because some of the parts and processes might be a little different. So let's get to it. So in order to do this repair, you will need to shut power off to the pump. I actually did this just on the display, but it's probably a good idea to go ahead and shut the circuit breaker off. That should be right next to your pool equipment. And then if you do have a self-cleaning pool like mine, you should have some type of a canister housing that looks similar to this. And you're going to need to unscrew the clamp that holds the cap in place on that housing. Now, my pool is right around 10 years old, and I was able to remove this clamp by hand. I did remove it a week before doing this actual video just to investigate to see what my problem was. Now, even though you don't have to fully remove this handle slash nut from the clamp, I went ahead and did it just because I thought it would make it a little easier to get the clamp completely off of the housing. Once you have removed the nut slash handle from the clamp, if you're having a hard time getting the clamp itself off of the housing and lid, you can grab a decent sized flathead screwdriver and basically wedge it between the lid and the clamp to help break it free. You can also use that flathead screwdriver if you're struggling to get the lid off of the housing once you've removed the clamp, to stick between that lid and the housing and either twist or wedge it up in order to help crack that seal as well. Now, this lid does have to be timed a certain way when you're going back together. There is a recessed area in the lid, and there is a raised little tab on the actual housing that you need to make sure you line up correctly when going back together. You could also take a picture of the cap so you know the basic orientation of that lid when you go back together, which is a good idea. Once you remove the lid, you will be able to see the planetary gear set. And a quick test you can do to see if your planetary set is working correctly is just spin that top gear. You'll notice that as I spin that top gear, the plastic housing inside there that is attached to those gears is slowly turning around in the housing. Now, that plastic housing inside there is not going to be moving fast. Because of all the gear reduction that's taking place with all those gears, you will need to spin that top gear extremely fast in order to barely make that planetary set actually move in the housing itself. Now, that was the new planetary that I had already put in that I was showing you that. However, if you have stripped out gears in any of those gears in that planetary, you can spin that top gear as much as you want, and that planetary set is just going to stay in the exact same place in the housing, telling you it is bad. Or if those planetary gears are starting to strip out, you might have an intermittent movement, basically catching sometimes but not catching others. Now, before disassembling this anymore, I do recommend taking pictures, especially of where the last planetary meets the housing, so you can tell when going back together whether you have the planetary in correctly and down all the way. So right here, I'm just removing that top gear by pulling it off the shaft. After that, I just reached in and grabbed the rest of the planetary set and lifted it straight up. There are 2 spacers or washers on top of that planetary set. You need to make sure you don't lose those in case this possibly isn't your problem and you need to go back together with it. Now, I had actually tried researching on Amazon to find the correct valve kit. However, I was struggling to make sure it was the right one, so I ended up calling Shasta, based out of Phoenix. And their parts guy was actually quite helpful over the phone to make sure I was ordering the correct kit. And believe it or not, they were actually 60 bucks cheaper than what it was on Amazon. I bought this entire kit for $120, and it actually came with a lot more than what the Amazon kit did for $180. So right here you can see what was my problem with the old one. You'll notice the gear set is completely stripped out right here, and the one next to it is still in perfectly good condition. Here's a quick view of the new one that I purchased, and you can see how that gear is supposed to look. It basically is supposed to look the same as the rest of the gears because they're all identical from what I could tell. Now, for whatever reason, you don't want to spend the money in order to get the new one. What I realized while I was editing this video is all these gears pretty much are identical. And you'll notice the last gear in the planetary set does not use that lower gear, so it was still perfectly brand new. So what you could do is just disassemble all these gears and switch out if you only have one bad gear with that last gear in the set, and then go ahead and put it back together and reuse that planetary set for now. So right there you can see the stripped out gear, and then I'm using just a pick to remove these clips that are holding those gears in place. So now I'm putting the bad one to the outside and then reassembling them as I took them apart. Now the clips are basically just a spring clip that hold these gears in place, so you do want to be careful if you are using a pick or a small flathead screwdriver in order to remove them so you don't distort them too bad. When going to put the retaining clips back on top of the shafts to hold the gears in place, I find the best way is just to set that clip and barely press it into place on the shaft by hand, and then grab a small socket that barely fits the diameter of that retaining clip. Right here I've got one just on my nut driver. I line the socket up with the retaining clip, and then just using the palm of my hand, give the top of my nut driver a light tap, and they press right into place. And right here you can see that as I spin that top gear, all the gears are moving. Obviously the bottom one's moving slower because of that gear reduction. And then you can go ahead and see me move the other side, which still has a stripped out gear, and all of the gears are moving except for that last gear kind of intermittently because that gear is stripped out. Now the kit I got from Shasta actually came with a new shaft, a new O-ring for the lid, a new cam, the new main gear set, and the top gear, along with a big set of thrust washers and a small set of thrust washers. So right here I'm just removing the shaft by pulling it straight up, and then removing the 2 big thrust washers that go underneath the T-valves. Went ahead and put the 2 new big thrust washers underneath the T-valves and centered the hole where the shaft goes through the housing. Took the new shaft and put it through those thrust washers and into the housing. Grabbed the new cam and slid it over the shaft. When putting this in place, you will have to lift up 3 of the T-valves in order to get the cam under those valves. So right here you can see basically how this valve body is working. You'll notice as I rotate that cam around, it's lifting those T-valves individually, and that is what directs your water flow to each one of the spray heads or the groups of spray heads in your self-cleaning pool. So right here I was getting ready to set the planetary back into place. However, there are 2 washers and you need to put these on before going over the shaft with the planetary kit. In order to make sure those washers stayed in place and didn't fall off while I was trying to install it, I put a little dab of Pool and Spa lube on each one of the washers so they would stick to each other and to that planetary kit. Then kind of angled them to get under the planetary gears and lined them up with where the shaft goes through that planetary. You'll notice that on the bottom of the gear set there is a round and square peg basically, and on the cam there is a round and square hole for the pegs to fit into. You need to make sure that you time those correctly so they fit into each other as you drop the gear set into the housing. So right here I'm just eyeballing it so I can set it in place and be as close as possible to being timed correctly. As you set it over the shaft, make sure you don't knock off those 2 thrust washers. Once setting it down, I just slowly rotated it back and forth until that cam lined up with the gear set and popped down into place. You do need to be careful with those outside gears to make sure they mesh with the inside of that housing so you don't put extra pressure on those gears as you're trying to get it in place. Once you've got it down in that cam and you're at the same height by checking with the picture you took before taking it apart, you can go ahead and set that top gear into place. Just like the gear set itself, you might have to spin it a little bit to get it to pop down into place and mesh with the other gears. And then you'll notice as I spin it, it is slowly rotating that gear set around in the housing. All that's left to do is put the lid on after that. So right here, I'm just removing the old O-ring from the lid. Then I went ahead and just rinsed that lid off in the pool to get any dirt or debris off of the sealing surface. Then went ahead and installed the new O-ring on the lid. I also wiped down the top of the housing where the O-ring mates with it, so there was no dirt or debris on it as well. As soon as I went to flip the lid down into position, the O-ring kept falling off of the lid. So then I used some of that pool and spa lube and put a little dab of it on 3 or 4 places on the O-ring to help hold it to the lid. I also took some of that lube and just put it on the sealing surface of the housing. This isn't really necessary, it's just something I decided to do to help lubricate that O-ring and hopefully keep it fresh over time. I also lubricated the threads of the clamp just to make that nut go on and tighten down a little easier. As you go to set the lid in place, remember that there is that raised little tab on the housing with a recessed area on the lid that you need to make sure you line up. When you have it timed correctly, you'll notice that this portion of the lid assembly is going to line up with the incoming water flow coming from the piping. As that water enters that part of the lid, then it's directed towards the center area of the lid, which goes around the top gear of the planetary and is what causes it to rotate, which in turn spins that top gear, which makes the rest of that planetary set slowly rotate around in the housing, changing the heads on your pool. So right here you can see I'm just setting the lid in place, lining up the tab with the slotted hole in the lid, making sure those are lined up correctly. You'll notice there is a little bit of side-to-side movement. That controls how fast or slow you want the water flow to enter to turn that top gear, which in turn controls how fast or slow you want it to rotate between the different sets of heads in your pool. You'll notice on the clamp when I'm putting it on that there is a recessed area in that clamp, and then there are 2 raised areas. You need to make sure those raised areas are above the lid and below the lip of the housing to make sure you are on correctly, and you need to verify that all the way around the housing and the lid. Once you have verified that the clamp is on correctly, you can go ahead and start the nut and tighten it down. Hand tight is plenty for this application. There's no need for using any type of an external plier or anything like that in order to tighten it down. Now, because I had already had the pump shut off, I did decide to clean out my leaf basket and the actual pump basket as well, and then went ahead and put those back together, and then all that was left to do was go ahead and turn the pump back on, or go ahead and turn on your main breaker if that's what you decided to do as far as shutting the pump off, and that's all there is to it. I did go back the next day and make sure the ground around the canister where I worked was completely dry, just to verify that I had no leaks after I was done with the project. And that is going to wrap it up for this video, guys. Hopefully you guys enjoyed it and it gave you some good information. If so, make sure you hit that like button and subscribe to my channel if you haven't already. I'd really appreciate it. The whole concept of my channel is to give you guys the most information in the least amount of time as possible so I don't waste your time. And I hope to see you next time. Have a good one. Later.